My new captain is just that. New. We'll probably be learning some lessons together. The captain spent a lot of time as a first officer, but has only been on the Dauntless for the last 4 months. From what I've read in the service records, I'm sure the captain will be a fine example for me. The bridge feels a little more social than I'm used to. It's understandable that the crew should feel comfortable with their former first officer in command. But respect and discipline should always be maintained on the bridge of a starship, and I intend to make sure they are.
Welcome to GameSpot Live. I'm Greg Kasavin, speaking on behalf of Desslock, our Canadian correspondent, who couldn't be here today to conduct the video review for Star Trek Bridge Commander. Bridge Commander was designed by Totally Games, a studio that's been around for quite some time and is responsible for a number of realistic and successful World War II flight simulations and also the extremely successful X-Wing and TIE Fighter games. They were really an obvious choice to create a simulation based on the other really famous science fiction property, Star Trek. There have been a couple of other Star Trek-themed simulations in the past, but they really didn't manage to convey the sense of the scale of the ships that you see in the television series and in the movies. So what Totally Games set out to do was to create a Star Trek simulation that actually did convey the size and scale and the epic sort of complexity and grandeur that you see in the Star Trek series. The good news is that they managed to succeed for the most part, and although the game is relatively short, it really is the first ever Star Trek game that makes you feel as though you're there on the bridge of one of these gigantic capital ships. What that amounts to is, unlike in most space simulations, you can't just turn on a dime and just circle around your opponents and fire at them, using these really quick motions. Instead, you're commanding this huge lumbering craft, and it's really quite difficult to bring its weapons to bear on any opponent you should come across. The goal isn't just to sit there and pound on the enemy ship until it blows up. You really have to focus your weapons onto particular subsystems, like you could take out the warp drive so the other ship can't get away, and you could even cripple it by taking out its weapon system so it can't even fire back. So the combat is very tactical and strategic. You need to make your decisions carefully, and the entire pacing of it is much slower than you'd find in games like X-Wing and TIE Fighter. As you've seen from the shows or the movies, of course, Star Trek isn't all about just blasting away at Klingon or Romulan vessels, but the Federation is supposed to be on a mission of peace. So to that end, Bridge Commander actually does include a fair amount of story in an almost adventure game-like setting where you need to interact with other characters and decide what to do at certain key points. You play as a character who's faceless and nameless and doesn't even speak. It's almost like Half-Life in that regard. It really tries to immerse you into the role of the character, and you get to interact with all the other members of your bridge. In fact, the entire game can be played as seen entirely through your character's eyes. You could just sit there in the captain's chair and order your AI crew to, raise and lower the shields, to fire weapons, to maneuver, to go into warp speed, and all those types of things. You can play the entire game as the captain and not as the pilot of this big ship. Granted, you can, in fact, control the ship yourself. You do this from a third-person, behind-the-ship perspective, and it's actually easier to play the game this way because, for the most part, you can usually perform a bit better as the pilot than your AI crew does. Star Trek fans will probably prefer the bridge view and will be interested to know that the game actually supports voice recognition technology, so you can really just sit there and issue orders, much like Captain Picard on the show. The single-player game does present some opportunity or apparent opportunity for branching points, but in fact it's mostly quite linear. Nevertheless, the story itself is quite interesting for Star Trek fans. It revolves around a region of space called the Maelstrom, where a mysterious supernova has occurred, and you're trying to figure out what's going on with all that. The game looks and sounds excellent in keeping with its closeness to the source material. You could see all kinds of detail on the ships and even see gigantic holes appear in them as they take damage, although unfortunately that doesn't appear in multiplayer. The crew members generally look realistic as well. They have digitized faces, and the only real problem is the lip syncing is a bit off, or rather quite off, and that can be a bit distracting. As mentioned, the single-player mode is relatively short, although there's a multiplayer mode that should keep you interested for a little while longer. However, the multiplayer mode is fairly simple, even though it does let you fly a variety of ships, and the netcode is pretty flaky, so you might experience some bugs and crashes as you're trying to hook up with other players. One of the other issues in the single-player game is that it automatically saves for you, generally in between the missions. The missions themselves can run pretty long and have multiple objectives, so sometimes after you finish one, or even two, you might fail and have to restart that whole sequence all over again, and that can really cost you some time. Also, for what it's worth, the game certainly isn't quite as difficult as good old X-Wing, which was notoriously hard back in its day. So Bridge Commander does have a few shortcomings. It's not super long and there's not a great deal of replay value to it. On the other hand, it's one of the most faithfully adapted Star Trek games that there's ever been, and it looks and sounds great as well. So with all that said, if you're a fan of Star Trek or of space sims in general, then you should certainly check it out. This is one of the only space sims that accurately recreates the sense of being on a big giant ship, and that's really quite an interesting accomplishment.